1999 The Podcast is a production of the Cage Club Podcast Network. For more podcasts on movies, comics, and all things pop culture, head to cageclub.me. To contact us with questions, comments, or just to say hi, send us an email at 1999@cageclub.me. You can find me on Twitter at probablyrealjb and Joey at soulpopped. And you can follow the show on Twitter at 1999 The Podcast. To support the show, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. The show is written, produced, and edited by us. Welcome to 1999 The Podcast, where we explore all the movies that made 1999 arguably the best movie year ever. I'm John Brooks.
And I'm Joey Lewandowski.
And in 2 weeks, we'll release our first episode dedicated to just one movie, and then we'll continue to do so every other Monday between now and the end of human civilization. Why 1999? Well, that's the subject of our first episode, the prequel to the official series. So this will be episode 0 for your bookkeeping purposes. Does that make sense? No, but also who cares?
Yeah, so today, John and I are joined by author, journalist, and devoted movie lover Brian Raftery. We're going to discuss his book, Best Movie Year Ever, and ask him why he thinks 1999 was so special.
Be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. But with that, we'll take a quick break and we'll be right back with Brian. Brian, thanks so much for joining us on what we're calling our prequel episode, which is consistent with sort of 1999 terminology. This is the episode where we kind of preview what we're going to be doing throughout this podcast and why we're doing it. And we realized there really just wasn't anybody better than bringing on the person who quite literally wrote the book on this subject. Before I start talking to you and about you, would you like to talk a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself, what you do, and why you are the ideal guest?
That's very kind of you. That is, I don't know if I'm the ideal guest for anything, but I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm a journalist, and I've been covering movies. Oh my gosh, almost for about 20. I mean, if you go back to when I was writing very bad articles about the Phantom Menace for my college paper, I've been writing about like 25 years or something. But I am a journalist in LA, and a couple years ago, I decided to write a book about the movies of 1999 and just sort of talk to a lot of the filmmakers and actors who were involved in that year, because it always struck me as a really kind of, not to be too grand or sweeping, but a very kind of epochal, kind of industry-changing year that was filled with all these really interesting films and a lot of new directors and a lot of new ideas and visions. But most importantly, I was there that year. I lived in New York. I went to see all these movies, and it was one of the most fun years to be going to the movies every weekend. 2 or 3 movies a weekend. It was just kind of it was like just one of the most fun moments for me as a quote unquote grown up moviegoer, to see all these movies coming out one weekend after the next and kind of having my mind blown on a regular basis.
Joey, I remember like you and I in one of another podcasts that you have done, you and I think there was this moment where I was like, wait, all these movies came out in 1999.
Yep.
I don't remember if I knew at the time that it was a big deal. I think I kind of did, right? But Brian, when did it sort of dawn on you? Like how long between, I mean, obviously it's been 20 plus years, right? In between when the year happened and when you wrote the book. But was there a point where you were like, wait, that one year, there was something going on there, and I need to sort of encapsulate it in this book?
Well, weirdly, I kind of knew it at the time, only because my first job out of college I was an intern at Entertainment Weekly, and I wound up working there for 4 years, and it was truly like the greatest job of my life in terms of being a young culture nerd and suddenly thrown into the offices of what was at that point the most fun, kind of snarky, informed group of movie nerds. And Entertainment Weekly actually did a cover story about 1999 before the year was over. I think it was November of that year. And I remember thinking like, oh, that's cool. But I was only like 23 or 24. And I probably at that point was like, yeah, every year is great. Every movie year is great. Like what's, I had just been like, did you see Starship Troopers 2 years ago? That was amazing. I was very much, the 90s were the decade in which I was finally allowed to see R-rated movies by myself. I worked in a video store in the 90s. I don't think it was, I'm not going to talk about every great 90s movie, and I'm not going to elevate every crummy 90s movie, but it was a really fun decade. So I was like, oh yeah, that's cool. Yeah, Matrix, Blair Witch, sure. But like I was so caught up in the fun of going to see these movies that I wasn't really putting together the big picture like that. But I think what really kind of changed it for me was about 5 or 6 years ago. I started to realize that that year was becoming more and more of sort of a faded memory. You know, we've had like these really extraordinary movie years since. I actually think last year was a pretty great movie year. I tried to make a top 10 of last year, and I had like 15 movies that I generally kind of loved. But the idea of these movies that were not only really artistically innovative, but also kind of culture changing and also seen by everyone, that was very, very unique to 1999. It's very rare that you get just these series of films where, you know, even the least commercially successful movie of that year is like Office Space, which who is not, you know, everyone has seen it. No matter how you did the box office in 1999, if you had a movie that was really interesting and connected with people, it kind of became a blockbuster on home video or on cable. And that kind of doesn't happen anymore. You know, movies come and go so quickly now, whereas it felt as though the movies in 99 were just always kind of hanging around the culture. And I think it's just because they arrived at a time when movies were incredibly important, but I also think these were also just a remarkably, you know, remarkably smart, savvy, really kind of dazzling group of movies.
So, Brian, I have a question. So, I was telling some people today about the show. I was saying, 1999 is a huge year, and it's something that, and a year that means a lot to John because Brian, I was only 11 in 1999, so like I actually saw none of these movies in theaters, and obviously I
Oh
love a
wow!
lot of these movies, but I didn't see any of them in theaters. I saw all the ones, like literally 100% of the ones that we've done or we will do for the podcast. I saw at home since 1999, and I was telling people about the idea, and they're like, "Yeah, but like." I think 2000 is a better year. No, I think 1997 is a better. I think
Mm.
like there's that debate, and I think you say something in the intro to your book that you could probably make the argument that every year is a good year for movies, and I do think that. But when people, because if you are the 1999 movie expert, like what about the year in particular? I know what you've already said, but like what's like the cocktail party answer of like why this is actually the best movie year ever? Is it just like what's your answer for like no, I think this year is a better year
Well,
or
it's
whatever?
yeah, it's funny because there's kind of two ways. Like, if you're at a cocktail party, one is kind of like there's a cocktail party trick to it, which is like you just start naming the movies. You just say, well, you know, The Matrix, Fight Club, Being John Malkovich, Election, you know, Boys Don't Cry, The Blair Witch Project, The Sixth Sense. You know, just keep going deep. You know, even stuff like Deep Blue Sea,
Oh
which a lot of
yeah,
people are like, oh yeah, I like
yeah.
that movie. I think the idea that all of these movies, you know, the smallest, like I said, some of the smallest movies of that year, you know, a movie like Go, which people loved. I mean, at home video, Go was like rented for 2 years by everyone who was like in high school and college. And so I think the kind of cocktail party trick is you just kind of overwhelm people with the number of movies. And you even point out, like, look, it was, you know, Star Wars: The Phantom Menace, which was a big movie, which was the biggest movie of the 90s in a way, just in terms of the fact that there was like 5 years of lead up to it. But what I think really kind of seals 99, and I'm also someone who thinks, you know, obviously 1939 or 1974 or 1994 or 19, you know, there's so many years you can pick out. But for me, it's always just these generations of filmmakers. You had, you know, Stanley Kubrick came back and made his first movie in more than a decade. He made Eyes Wide Shut. George Lucas came back and made his first movie in a decade. So you have, you know, this really kind of elder statesman generation of filmmakers coming back. Then you have all these filmmakers making their first movie. You have Sofia Coppola making The Virgin Suicide. You have Brad Bird making The Iron Giant. You have, you know, Spike Jonze making Being John Malkovich. So you have this younger generation who's just starting to emerge. And at the same time, the kind of middle class, kind of, I don't want to say middle class, but sort of like middle aged kind of filmmakers who had been kicking things around in the 90s just made some of their best movies. You know, David Fincher made Fight Club. You know, Steven Soderbergh made The Limey, which every year goes up higher and higher on everyone's, like, Steven Soderbergh's top 10 list. You had Michael Mann making The Insider. And these are movies that cost tons of money, had huge stars, and were absolutely not commercial at all. I mean, like a movie like Three Kings, it's so insane that David O. Russell got to go basically make a huge anti-war comedy, drama, action heist movie with George Clooney and Ice Cube and Spike Jonze for like $60 million, about a war that, you know, about war in the Middle East, early 90s, that some people were still very sensitive about. So I think there was just like you can pick out any year and make a list of movies and go, here's 15 great movies from this year. It gets harder when you're sort of looking at like how those movies impacted the years to come and the kind of immediate impact those movies had and who was getting to make those movies. Look, you had Boys Don't Cry, which is Kimberly Pierce. I mean, I'm not saying that movies were any more equitable in terms of who's going to make movies, but you had a lot of really emerging first time black filmmakers like Malcolm Lee. You had, the Wachowskis making The Matrix. You just had a lot of people breaking into people's imaginations through movies in a way that I just don't know if there's a year in the 90s or afterward that quite comes close.
The other thing I really appreciated, and I will be honest with you that I did not read too much of your book because I have this tendency to like regurgitate other people's ideas as my own. And I'm just like, oh, well, Brian said, and Brian said. So I didn't want to read too much before we did the podcast.
I didn't read it either. It's totally fine. I never read the whole thing.
Awesome. We're on the same page there.
It's really good, Brian. You should read it.
Yeah, sorry. Page 19 is just a wiki entry on the musical Cats, and then I just copy and paste it. But no one reads, so no one notices.
But what I really appreciated about the intro was that you said that it also felt like, and I think this goes to the point you were just making about the people making their best movies or starting or whatever, is that it's people who grew up on the movies of like 65 to like 77 or however you break it down, and how like that is, because I think that, today, the age I am now at 34, it's like a lot of the things that I grew up with are coming back either as reboots or just like the styles or whatever, because like people my age are able to make movies now. And so the things that I grew up with are making their way and showing on screen or whatever. But I think the fact that the point you make about all these filmmakers growing up with like a really radical time for filmmaking and like really like the first wave of like crazy, crazy stuff, I think that's a really cool thing that I never thought about before. So it's not only the fact that like 1999 was on the precipice of Y2K and right before 9/11, and just also just a great year for movies, but like the context with which these filmmakers were approaching their craft by the things they grew up with, I think is fascinating. If you have anything more to say about that, or if you want to elaborate on that, because I think that's a really interesting thing that I never thought about before today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the fun parts of that year is that it really felt like, almost 100 years of movie history was kind of being distilled into one 12-month period. I mean, you can't make The Matrix without The Wizard of Oz. You can't make what's funny is that both two movies from 99 that are very dissimilar, Fight Club and Rushmore, both were deeply influenced by The Graduate, which is kind of hilarious. It makes sense when you watch them both. Maybe
great, yeah.
I think Fight Club's a little more spiritually influenced by The Graduate, but there is it's a dark, humorous story about about a young man who does not feel in place in the world and how he lashes out. And you had all these great. I think the opening of American Beauty, I think, was basically influenced by Sunset Boulevard was an influence. So you have all these great. These were filmmakers who. It wasn't like you had this group of filmmakers who were coming and saying, the history of Hollywood sucks. We're making our own thing. They were like, the history of Hollywood is amazing, and we have taken the good stuff and we're fusing it with new ideas and new technology to make something that's completely, steeped in the sort of really classic filmmaking of the past, but is absolutely going to be made for a circa 2000 or circa 21st century audience. I mean, I don't know how you get a movie like, I don't know, like The Sixth Sense without so many years of like really classic, chilly kind of like horror. I don't know if M. Night Shyamalan's ever said The Exorcist was a direct influence, but I feel it's that kind of same kind of mold. Yeah,
obviously.
I mean, you have movies like that, right. And the Blair Witch Project is basically just like a really great, creepy ghost story. It's probably closer to like silent film horror movies and completely chopped up and made on digital camera. I mean, to me that's the most fun part of it. That's the most fun art for anything, whether it's music or TV or film, is something that's very much of the moment and 5 years ahead of time, while also kind of pulling in so many interesting elements from the past. I think that's what was really fun about the movies of that year.
So I think you've brought up something that is one of the ingredients, sort of this project that we're doing, which is I hadn't really thought about before, which is sort of the, like, I guess you'd say third and fourth generation directors kind of passing the baton and like having their, I mean, Malick obviously made a lot of great movies after, but like The Thin Red Line was sort of his return, and then also kind of I don't know how I'd classify it, but like that and Eyes Wide Shut. And so you have Malick and Kubrick and some other directors who are kind of closing chapters on their work, and then you have sort of the emergence of new voices, and then also sort of people like Fincher who are sort of finding where their voice really is. And I have to say, like, one of the things as well that I think is so interesting about this year and sort of what we have planned is that I don't necessarily like all of these movies. I don't necessarily think they're great. I actually think Fight Club is Fincher's worst movie. Uh, I include Alien 3.
Well, I think that's crazy. I just think that's crazy.
I understand. Well, not worst, but I say of his really accomplished movies, it's the one that I'm least attached to, and that I think is sort of least interesting. But I think it's also his most important movie because I do think it also sort of reset a lot of rules and allowed him to do things in the future and other directors to do things in the future that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. And so, like, one of the things that I think I noticed about this year, unique to it, is, and Brian, tell me if you agree, is if it's not so much if it's a good movie, it's that there's all these really bold experiments happening that ultimately pay off later, right? And Blair Witch, I think, is a really obvious example of that, where it's like, this is not a great movie, but you are doing things in this movie, including the fact that it's not even really about it being a movie. It's about it being a project, right? As the name suggests, that are obviously that pay dividends in franchises and ideas down the line, including the whole idea of like the found footage movie and the incredibly successful Paranormal Activity series and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, Blair Witch is interesting because one thing that I'd kind of forgotten until I started researching this was in my mind. I think we all have this cultural memory that after the Blair Witch Project came out, there were suddenly 5,000 found footage things, and
right.
I think Paranormal Activity. I think the first one was like 2007 or something. It took a long time, and honestly, I think the reason is, and I know this is probably the most divisive movie in the whole book. I think the Blair Witch Project is great. Like, I remember seeing it at a screening in Midtown Manhattan, and I remember gripping the seats. And maybe you had to have that experience. Like, maybe I know a lot of people watched it on home video, and it was like, I mean, I imagine watching it at a sleepover would have been super fun. But I do remember seeing it like just 2 weeks before it opened, and I genuinely thought it was terrifying. I did not think it was real. By then, everyone knew it wasn't real. But it's so funny because I would interview a lot of people for this. I interviewed like 130 people for this book, people who worked on all these movies. And without a doubt, if someone was under 25 when the Blair Witch Project came out, they loved it. If I was interviewing someone who was older, who was like in their 40s or 50s now, they were like, that movie was such a piece of garbage. But you can't deny how, I mean, I think even people who, I don't want to paraphrase him, but I think when I talked to Fincher, he was basically saying at one point, I don't know if it was in the book, but he's like, look, the Blair Witch Project was not a great movie, but he was really impressed by what it did formally. And a lot of these movies did things that were either like really on the surface inventive, like The Matrix Bullet Time, which was instantly kind of ripped off. I mean, that was sort of the thing. The next 2 years, you had so many bad Matrix ripoffs at advertisements, but some things were a little more subtle. And I think it was some of the ideas that crept in. Like, I just think that, it was the last kind of era of really kind of navel gazing, kind of like, who are we as humans, existentialist kind of movie going. And I think that started to creep in more into mainstream films. Like, and these weren't always super deep movies, but I mean, if you look at Office Space and The Matrix and Fight Club, they're all movies that are about like being shackled to your desk, and I think they spoke to a certain kind of ennui and anger that would kind of become matter of fact in the next 10 years, where people are like, oh yeah, like, why did we spend the 80s and the early 90s thinking that work was awesome? Like, this sucks. Like, this whole life sucks. We're all chained to these desks and these computers, and we don't want to be doing this anymore. And then we all just wound up doing that even worse when cell phones came out. But, I do think there's a long tail for these movies that, I think in some ways those movies are still popping up in ways we don't even understand. And I got to say, like, one thing that shocks me is of all the movies that when I wrote this book, I was expecting to talk about for years afterward, I was not expecting Eyes Wide Shut to become this like weird, like, people talk about Eyes Wide Shut as if it was a $500 million like blockbuster. It's referenced, it's memed. It's, like, honestly, like, some of the Illuminati stuff in Eyes Wide Shut, I think is what started burying. I think it started melting people's minds about various other conspiracy theories. Like, it's an incredibly sneakily intellectual or influential movie, but no one's made a movie like it. It's just the ideas in it and the general vibe of that movie is now so sought out and so loved and such a part of the culture, where we now just basically, think that rich people are having weird gonzo sex parties and people are dying at them. And we're like, yeah, that makes sense. Whereas 20 years ago, it was people like, yeah, I don't want to go see that in a movie. That sounds weird.
Yeah, it's really interesting too. I think that a lot of the way that a lot of these particular movies in this particular year have sort of infected our culture now, so much later, is really fascinating. Nobody who wasn't me that I knew liked Eyes Wide Shut in 1999. I loved it, but like I literally nobody else would talk about it with me because they didn't like the movie. And I don't know if people like it anymore now, but certainly it has this sort of weird sort of sponged into the culture thing that it's done. And I think that's true of The Matrix is obviously very popular at the time, but like it's become so much more than that, right? The way that it's sort of seeped into the culture. Yeah, and I think that's sort of one of the things that makes it, even like Magnolia to a certain extent, right? Like some of the references in Magnolia, I think, are transcend even people who probably have never even seen that movie.
No, and I think Magnolia and Fight Club, especially, and maybe American Beauty in some ways. I mean, no one was using the term toxic masculinity 20 years ago, and it's a term that I think is now like very important to talk about, but I think has almost become almost watered down. That we need to find a new way to talk about it. But those two movies are very much about like angry men with power and what they want to do, and like you look at Tom Cruise's character in Magnolia, who is just like this absolute monstrous narcissist, awful guy who uses sex and talking about sex as a true weapon. And you look at some of the Fight Club adherents who are just want to blow things up, and it's like, well, we're having those conversations every day about these kind of people. Like these kind of ideas are really kind of crept into day-to-day conversation, and we have not solved the problems of toxic masculinity in any way.
I'm wondering also, as you talk about both Magnolia and Eyes Wide Shut, John, I think the podcast you might have referenced before was specifically when we did Cruise Club, because Brian, we had a show on the network where I watched with my friend Mike, we watched all of Tom Cruise's movies, and there's something fascinating about like the biggest movie star in the world effectively going away for 2 years. Like he just stops making movies because he spends like, what is it, like 230 or it's like 200 something days, right, with Kubrick and his wife, which that doesn't end well, you know what I mean? But like there's something about like them making two of the best movies of the decade together, or like Cruise being in both, Cruise making it, like it's just, there's something about the star power and the scope of it and the breadth of it that even though it's not $500 million, like it's this, I don't know, it just, I think that what these movies do, for better or worse, is that no matter what you're interested in, whether it's genre or star power or themes or just cool stuff, like there's just something for everybody. And I think the Cruise element of it all can't be overstated, I think, because he's not like the star of Magnolia, but he is, like you were just saying, like one of the main thematic plot points, and boy, well, for sure one of the most memorable scenes in that movie when like his introduction, right? So I don't know.
Oh, I mean, it's the most. It's really, like I'm not trying to oversell this, but in my lifetime, since I've been going to the movies for like 35 years or so, more 40 years, I guess. I'm only 19, but it seems I've been going to movies for a while. I really can't think in my mind of like a time when a major star used their power to do something so unstar-like as when Tom Cruise made those two movies. And it's like I think they're the two. As someone who loves risky business, it's one of my favorite movies. I do think Eyes Wide Shut and Magnolia, when you think of them as like just one big movie, are the best thing. They're both like the best thing he ever did, and it's also what he could do as a star. Is that he could say to Warner Brothers, like, I want to make this with Stanley Kubrick, and we're going to go away for, like you said, like they weren't saying we're going to go away for a year and a half or 2 years. I mean, it wound up spiraling, but look, Stanley Kubrick's like, I'll let some executives at Warner Brothers see this script, but not all of them. And away they went. And that's what you could do back then. And I think it's like, I went to go see The Godfather in theaters a couple weeks ago. I love The Godfather. And I know there's this like 8-part Paramount TV series coming out about the making of The Godfather, which I will happily watch. But the 8-hour movie I want to see a making of is Eyes Wide Shut. I want to see the whole thing. I want to see a dramatic recreation. I want to see the day Paul Thomas Anderson came onto set and was hanging around Stanley Kubrick and probably asking him annoying questions. I want to watch like Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman driving back from the set after 15 hours, like, and realizing they have 12 more months to go. Like, that to me is a fascinating movie. That movie is like, that is one of the few movies from that year that I think the making of could be just a whole book. If you ever got the two of them to talk about it.
And that's maybe 20 years away if that series ever happens.
Right,
but who knows? Fingers crossed.
Tom Cruise will want to play himself. I think it's the thing. He will want to digitally de-age and play himself Yeah.
So yeah, I think that one of the the Cruise example is a good one, because another thing that seems to kind of be happening here is a lot of the sort of power dynamics that had ruled Hollywood for the previous couple decades are shifting. New ways of being famous are happening, right? There's new sort of there's people who want to take risks, and there's a changing of the guard, and like a lot of that's sort of illustrated, I think, by what happens with Tom Cruise here. Um, the interesting thing, of course, is like when we're doing this podcast and when it comes to your book, you had set certain rules of like what counts as 1999. We are doing the same thing somewhat arbitrarily. Rushmore does not make that cut. Thin Red Line does not make that cut.
Yeah.
So we're not doing those two, but like Run Lola Run does.
Oh god, yeah,
for
great
us.
movie. Yeah.
And of course, like when you talk about Eyes Wide Shut, like that was in development for like 1,000 years, and so it wasn't really a 1999 movie. It was mostly made in like 97, and so obviously you're really dealing with a several year span here, right? But so you can't just attribute everything to sort of Y2K, I don't think. And I think that we've established a couple other things. I think another one that I thought of though today, I was actually listening to your great Siskel and Ebert podcast,
Thanks,
Roger, which is phenomenal. And I like you, like Siskel and Ebert were a huge part of my life, right, growing up as well.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me when I was listening to it, I was like, oh right, when Gene Siskel died, February 1999, like that was a really big moment. And I've now sort of been reflecting on the impact that Siskel and Ebert had in modern day film criticism, that it's completely reshaped the way we think about what it is to critique a movie, and the way that everybody on the internet talks, and also the way that like there was a transition there from the death of Siskel to like the rise of Harry Knowles and Ain't It Cool News, especially around the Phantom Menace. Do you want to talk about that for a second? Like, what are your thoughts on the way that not just, I mean, obviously you can talk about the internet when it comes to Blair Witch, but not just in terms of the way that it's used to sell movies, but the way that like internet culture is starting to shape and change the way that sort of we both see movies, but also sort of process them and critique them, right? The way we do today versus in the Siskel and Ebert days.
Yeah, and it's funny. Actually, at one point when I was reporting the book, I actually thought I was going to have a whole thing. I was really going to get into Siskel passing away and sort of talk about how while these movies were arriving, the idea of criticism and who gets to talk about movies, and who do we, how does opinion get shaped and ideas get formed, was all changing because the internet. And it never quite worked for the book. But I mean, absolutely. I mean, you look at, it's very weird for me. I'm always trying to figure out in my mind if there was like a switch moment when it kind of went from the traditional newspaper critics, TV critics, to the internet sort of discourse. I mean, certainly, for better or worse, I was someone who, in college and in my early 20s, I mean, some people would check CNN.com first thing. I would usually check Ain't It Cool News or like some of the other. I mean, I was very invested in whether the photos of the 1998 Godzilla would leak, stuff like that, which was a remarkable waste of my time, and probably
speaking of Siskel and Ebert, by the way,
exactly.
who make
that's right,
joke cameo in that movie.
Yeah. But it was starting to change, and it's. I do think when you look at the 99 movies, there are a couple of these films did kind of bump up against that. Certainly, I interviewed Ahmed Best about playing Jar Jar a couple of years ago for Wired, and certainly the abuse that he got after the Phantom Menace came out was very much one of those things we look at and you go, oh, well, this was the beginning of something bad. I mean, it was this idea of people piling on a performer who's, just because they're in a movie they don't like, this crazy kind of like personal attacks, which got very personal against him. That's the bad side of internet culture that started to emerge in 99. I do think that there was a lot of joy in discussing these movies online. I think The Matrix was also certainly one of those movies that, even though I was not caught up in the 1999 Ain't It Cool News message board discourse, it was kind of fascinating to dip in and out of it, because a lot of these movies were very open to interpretation. And it was, even though you had a lot of people chiming in and it got very noisy, it wasn't the kind of conversations we have now, which tend to be more, here's a plot hole I found, here's a character I found problematic. It was more just sort of like, what did this movie mean to you? What did it mean to me? And I think some of these movies inspired those kind of conversations, which was which was very fun and kind of a maybe more innocent version of online movie discourse that's completely gone now. I mean, maybe it's somewhere else and I'm just not seeing it. But it didn't feel as strident and as kind of mean spirited as internet movie discourse would become. But it was certainly growing at that point. And yeah, I mean, word of mouth helped these movies a lot. I think a lot of people, a movie like Election, no one saw in the theater, and I think it took home video and probably people online saying, "This is good. You should go see Election," to kind of give that little boost.
See, that's what's fascinating because like I literally grew up in the internet era, and I don't remember, like I wasn't, this is a weird thing to say, but I wasn't a fan of movies really before the internet. Like, not that they're
Mm,
correlated, but like I never had to check the I never had that experience really of like the waiting for Godzilla's images. Like everything was just at my fingertips basically. And so
yeah.
to have this like sort of idyllic or more positive, like I just, I kind of long or yearn for a time where there's like more civil discourse around movies, but I don't know, like that just, and that's the like I was saying this to John. I will admit one of my insecurities here on the podcast is that like 1999 meant so much for him because he saw all these in theaters, but I'm like I didn't see
Mm.
any of them, and like I hope that like I'm able to look at them as movies. Like I understand like good movie or bad movie, but like to me like it wasn't a movie year. Like if anything, it was like a video game year or something, right?
Oh
So
yeah,
like
yeah.
I don't know. It's a fascinating thing, and I'm just trying to put my time capsule shoes something on. That's a thing, right?
And for some people, it's a TV year. I mean, that's the thing. It's like 99's
Yeah.
also. I mean, it's one of the biggest. I don't know if the NSYNC record that came out that year was the highest selling first week of all time, or it was the one afterward. But like, Napster was around in '99, and one of the disconnects is that when I would do interviews for this book, people would say, "Oh, well, Napster was blowing up," and it's like actually Napster. It started in 99, but really 2000, 2001, 2002 is
Yeah.
when it really.
Yeah.
So 99, people were just buying literally millions of CDs every week. They were watching TRL. So for some people, it's a music year. For some people, it's like, yeah, they were watching The Sopranos and they were like, this is a TV year. This is the HBO year. It is, even though I do think movies were still kind of like at the very top of pop culture at that point. Certainly video games were huge by the late 90s. I mean, they were just, there were so many things going on. And that's one thing that is so kind of impressive about that year for movies is that for all the things that were going on, everyone knows what the rules of Fight Club are. You know what I mean? Like these things these ideas, this dialogue from movies still manage to puncture and sort of break through the culture. Whereas nowadays, it's much harder for a movie to. Like, it's very hard for a movie catchphrase that's not from a Marvel movie to actually circulate and kind of become known to everyone.
Because there's no
Whereas,
monoculture anymore, right? Or just
yeah,
Right.
so
yeah.
fragmented.
Yeah, and maybe the monoculture never existed, and we just kind of convinced ourselves it did. But I'm thinking, I think about it a lot because nowadays I'm kind of like, I don't really need the monoculture anymore, and it's mourned a lot. And I'm like, yeah, but there was also a lot of bads. I mean, there's also a lot of bad movies in '99 too. There's a lot of bad studio movies made in the '90s, and
Yeah.
I'm very wary of being the '90s nostalgist because I'm like, boy, I sat through a lot of crap and a lot of terrible things happened in the world. But yeah, it did feel as though at least back then. Even if for you it was a music year, like you saw the Blair Witch Project. You know what I mean? You had to go see it. Like maybe you didn't see Three Kings, maybe you didn't see Election, but you were definitely going to check out the South Park movie. I mean, these things were sort of popped through and really kind of had a real presence over the rest of popular culture.
Yeah, it's funny, the monoculture thing, and I do think that this year is as good as any to start looking at when monoculture starts to fade away and something takes its place. One of the reasons why the sort of Gene Siskel thing stuck out to me is I remember, and I'm sure you do, Brian, that the big thing, like when you got the Sunday paper and you looked at those one-page, movie poster spreads for a movie coming out, if it had the 2 thumbs up, like emblazoned on it, like that was the seal of approval. Like that's when you
Yeah.
went to go see the movie. That was the 98% Rotten Tomato rating. That was the 79+% Metacritic rating, right? That was the thing, and it was enormously influential. But of course, then without it, Ebert tried to go on without Siskel to varying success. I think Roper was pretty good, but like it was never the same cultural phenomenon. And the 2 thumbs up thing really did not have the influence that it would have before. And so I think that's sort of when it kind of opened up the door for internet. And Joey, like one of the reasons why I think why I love talking to you about this sort of thing is the little age gap between us is like I don't use Letterboxd, right? But like I know a lot of people do and like rely on that as a way of sort of tracking and sort of validating movies or whatever. And there's definitely a story that I think kind of begins here, right? That is told there.
I think that with everything, whether it's Letterboxd or Metacritic or Rotten Tomatoes or Siskel and Ebert or whatever, I think you just need to find the metrics that kind of work for you. And because like I don't know if I don't think I've said this in the episode that we recorded yet, but like I hate Rotten Tomatoes. I think it's like a broken system. And like I understand people who like it. I understand people why they appreciate it. But I think just like if a movie is like a C plus across the board and it's 100%, but it's like, well, that doesn't mean it's a good movie. It doesn't mean that I should want to see it or whatever, right? And I prefer other things, but like even other things are skewed. And so I don't know. Like I think I think with everything, whether it's 1999 movies or anywhere, it's just anybody who cares enough about movies should know that find a metric that works for you or something, or just see everything. That's a simpler way. Just watch
That's
everything.
what you do. Yeah.
You know, it's funny. Because like I mentioned, I worked in the video store in the '90s, and there were two ways to get. And I worked in a suburban video store. People actually were not like, people there were not. They had very good taste, but sometimes it would be hard to steer some people. And I would say, if there was a movie that we really liked or that I really liked, if you said Siskel and Ebert gave it 2 thumbs up, or you said it won Best Picture or got an Ivor Best Picture, those are the two ways to really kind of convince someone who was on the fence to rent something. Yep. Nowadays, I have no idea what the equivalent of that is. And my own, honestly, I think the only way to be up on movies and to find new movies that you like, I'm not trying to be glib, but like have friends with really cool movie taste. I would say 90% of the movies that I saw last year, not 90%, no, I go to the movies all the time. So, I mean, I'm definitely primed to see most movies either way. But I would say of the smaller movies that I saw last year that I loved, I would say half of those became because a friend texted me and said, "You got to see Shiva Baby. You will love this." You know what I mean? Like those are the kind of things where and that's the kind of thing where like Shiva Baby was already on my list, but it goes from number 6 to number 1. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there's this weird amorphous thing. And sometimes a movie blows up on Twitter and people are like, "Oh, so-and-so is great. You should go see this." And that helps me a lot. I don't really turn to Rotten Tomatoes. I don't really have, there are critics I love reading after I see a movie, which I've always done. I've always been someone who comes back from a movie and then reads the reviews because I just like seeing how other people think about it. But, unless it's a movie like Old Henry, which I saw a bunch of critics I like saying, "Hey, this is a great, cool, dark Western." That's one of the few movies last year where I just saw a bunch of critics give me good reviews and I'm like, "Oh, I really want to see that." And I trust, the critic at Vulture. I trust the critic, over here or there. And so that's what pushes you. But honestly, just have good friends. And then it's like, I use Letterboxd to remember what I saw because I have middle-aged brain, but also I like when people do very funny one-liners about a movie.
Yep.
I don't use it to I don't really use it as a guide of what I should see because honestly, on any given day, I have 30 movies I already want to see. So for me, it's always a matter of what should I put at the top of my list right now, and listen to good podcasts too. There's a lot of podcasts now that I listen to about movies, new movies that I'm out for a walk and I stop and like email myself the names of movies. I'm like, oh, I gotta see this, which is not good for my health because I'm eventually either going to stop walking or walk into in front of a car while doing this. But yeah, I think word of mouth is just like, honestly, just make as many cool, smart movie going nerd friends as you can. You will never be lacking for good movie recommendations.
Yeah. And I think, you hit on something really interesting. I don't want to not to get too far off topic here, but like we had video stores then and the culture was very different. And I think that Letterboxd, from what I know about the way people use it, is they use it as in many ways a replacement for that sort of video store recommendation culture. I worked in a video store in the late 90s as well, and making the employee recommendation shelf like for each employee was like the best fucking thing. It was so great. And you don't have that anymore, right? Anywhere. So finding ways on the internet to sort of replicate that, I think, has been really interesting. And it also, it reminds me of this whole monoculture idea, which I do think was a real thing, by the way. Like, I remember when the X-Files was on and like how ubiquitous it was, in the Friday night when you would watch it and then like you'd have to remember everything by Monday. So at school you could, talk about it on Monday. One thing I think is really kind of cool about what's happening right now is that like with like Disney Plus, with its like tentpole shows is launching them or streaming them on the same day and like one episode a week and sort of reproducing some of that monoculture so that we're all watching like The Mandalorian on the same Wednesday, right? And then sort of tweeting about it or whatever. And you are sort of getting some of that back, which is, I think, a really interesting way that sort of the internet since Y2K has sort of retro engineered something that it also took away, which is just kind of a fascinating kind of cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, and I mean, and no one, I think, the monoculture going away is probably for the best. I do think it's like there was a lot of people being shut out from getting work made. The
Yeah.
thing is, once in a while, when there is a big pop cultural phenomenon, like the most fun thing to happen to moviegoers in the last 10 years, I swear, is Get Out. Because Get Out played for 8 months. Everyone saw it. Everyone knew the references. No one could stop talking about it. As soon as you saw it, like the first time I saw it on a Thursday night when it opened in a crowded theater with one of those theaters that served booze, and it was like the most fun movie going experience. And I think a movie like that, where everyone sees it, everyone knows what the sunken place is, everyone knows the lines, it's just like that is really fun, because it's really fun when you see a movie you love and you tell a friend, "Oh, go see that," and then call me after. You know what I mean? That is really. I had a really fun thing a couple weeks ago when the Batman came out. Like the next morning, I saw Thursday night when it opened. The next morning, I texted like one of my good Batman loving friends. I was like, "Hey, what time are we going to jump on the phone today to talk about this?" Like,
right.
And that is really fun. And I just wish it happened for more things than just Marvel movies. I wish there were kind of mid-sized monoculture movements that weren't necessarily born of IP and franchises. So when something like Get Out happens, it's really fun when it feels like, oh, we're all excited about something that we've never seen before, and that's part of the joy, is just talking about it with others.
And I will say, like, to Marvel's credit, like what they've done with the MCU in creating something that we're all into, right? Like everybody's seen every Marvel movie and talks about it and references it and all that sort of thing. Like it's, maybe it takes up too much of the air in the room. I don't know, but it is cool that exists and that we have this sort of thing that we all know, right? We all know what happens in all of the movies, and
and I mean, and for people but the thing is too, is that people who want to opt out of that, there's so many other smaller side MCUs. It's like it's like people. It's like I don't know if you have any Downton Abbey obsessives in your life, but those fans.
I'm one of them.
Yeah, they're hardcore. Like this Downton Abbey movie is going to be like the Avengers for people who love Downton Abbey.
I can't wait.
Yeah, and I mean, there's all kinds of like mini pockets. But I do wish there were a couple more that were all just kind of grooving to. Like that was one of the most fun things about the pandemic, where it's like everyone's watching The Sopranos again. I'm like, all right, we're all watching The Sopranos again. We're all talking about The Sopranos. So when it's fun, when that happens, it's fun. It's like I do miss that. I mean, look, I worked at Entertainment Weekly. I love pop culture. I love talking about other people. It's just and I have friends that don't go to the movies as much anymore, and who I used to see movies with and watch everything with, and it does kind of bum me out. Where I'm like, hey. Have you seen Worst Person in the World yet? Are you gonna go see it? Like when are we gonna be able to talk about this? So yeah, I do love. I don't want a monoculture, but I don't mind a occasionally monolithic thing popping into the culture.
Well, I think that's what's nice about everything that we're talking about here, is that the people who grew up with it or experience it at some point are seeing this return, or this possible return, if they want to re-embrace it, as a good thing. And then people who never, like like Gen Z or whatever, just like, oh, like this is a different way to watch it, and like it's they're discovering it for the first time. Like there's sort of the best of both worlds there, that they can watch all 200 whatever episodes of Friends in a weekend if they want, but also they have this same kind of shared cultural experience. I think that, like, the farther we get away from everything, the closer we're going to wind up back at the thing. So I don't know. I like it.
Yeah, I like it too. And I think it's so interesting. Like, I don't have a lot of Gen Z people in my life, but my experience is that for them, pop culture is just this flat circle sort of thing, where it's like there's no future, there's no past. It's like The Sopranos could pop up in the same way that, like, with the Ting Tang song from a couple, what was it? That's Not My Name.
Oh, the
like
Ting Tang song. Yeah.
Ting Tang. Sorry, Ting Tang. Sorry. But like, these things can just be plucked out of this giant flat timeline that is pop culture, which I think is a much more, like, I kind of envy them. Like, I definitely wish when I was 15, 16, 17, that I've been able to find a cool 60s weirdo movie or horror movie that I just blew up one day. That'd be a really fun way to discover it, as opposed to, like, trying to find something in the back of a video store or some late night monster movie. Like, it is exciting to me that people are excited about popular culture and finding new ways and new things to get excited about, no matter where it comes from.
I love that you made that with a True Detective reference.
I didn't even realize I was doing it until I got there, but yeah, I guess I was. Yeah.
Hey, Brian, I don't know if this is a Sophie's Choice thing, but do you have a favorite movie from 1999? I don't know. You might even include this in the book, but do you have a favorite movie from that year?
I don't. I had, it's funny. I would do top five lists when the book came out, and it always shifted. And now it's almost been, it's close to 5 years since, it's 5 years since I wrote that book, and almost 5 years since it came out. So I think it would change a lot. I do remember thinking while I was working on it that I really thought Election was kind of a perfect movie. I mean, it's so well made and it's so funny, and just feels so more transgressive every time I watch it. I think Three Kings is really spectacular. I'm not a huge David O. Russell fan, but I think that's his sharpest comedy, and it's the kind of movie that I really like, which is a very big budget kind of fu, which I think is very hard to make.
Yeah.
I do really dig. It's funny. I'm gonna probably show my oldest kid The Sixth Sense a little bit, like maybe in a year or two, because I don't think she has no idea about the twist, and I'm kind of excited to watch it. And I think that movie holds up remarkably well. It's just like classically made storytelling. But I don't have, and I there's also like ones that I didn't include in the book. Like I really do love Deep Blue Sea. It's one of my favorite genre movies of the last 25 years. There's a really fantastic cannibalism movie called Ravenous that came out that year, which is like
Yeah.
insane. Like it's had a very troubled production, so it's kind of a mess, but it has a A+ fantastic score, and it's just like a really cool, creepy, dark, gnarly, low budget studio horror movie. And so even stuff like that, I've been rediscovering the last couple of years. But I don't know. I mean, Election seems to be also, when I talk to all the filmmakers for the book, that does seem to be the one movie that everyone across the board love. But I don't know. Tomorrow might be The Limey. It could always change.
And then the follow-up question, because I appreciate all that. Do you have a favorite movie that's not from 1999, or is that also equally difficult?
Oh, like of all time?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think the movie I think about and has enveloped my whole life. There's probably two. One is Jaws, which is just absolutely, I could watch. It's the movie I've seen. I've probably seen it the most, more than any other movie. I know it so well. Like I love the movie. I was fascinated with it before I even saw it. And then I also, when Pulp Fiction came out, I saw it 5 times in the theaters. There's stuff about the Pulp Fiction that doesn't square well with me in 2022. But man, that movie was just such a mind breaker and an eye opener for me about what you could do with movies, and just such a blast. So those two are probably, but it's also, I love old noir movies. I mean, The Taking of Pelham 123 is like my favorite 70s movie, which is not, aside from Jaws, which is like a Walter Matthau, Robert Shaw train robbery movie. I absolutely love it. I've seen it a million times. But again, like I don't know. Right now, The Worst Person in the World, which I've seen twice in the theaters, is probably my favorite movie.
Yeah, that movie's awesome.
Like, yeah, but Licorice Pizza was my favorite movie a few months ago. Drive My Car was my favorite movie the week I saw it. I mean, I just fall in love with movies still very, very easily.
Last question before we go, and I think you're the person who's best to ask this. You can guess the movies that we're going to cover, everything we've talked about, obviously. And maybe it's Ravenous, I don't know. But is there a movie that you think we might not get to that we absolutely should, in your estimation?
I mean, I really think that even though I know some people have a lot of problems with it, no, I think Boys Don't Cry is an incredibly important movie. I think that there is pushback on it that I absolutely understand at this point. But it's just a movie that I think people in the late 90s, maybe someone thought of it as homework, which I hate when people say that, but it's a beautiful movie. It's really, really, really good. I'm trying to think of other ones that are might fall through the cracks. I mean, there's, I really don't want to be the guy who just talks about Deep Blue Sea 4 times in a podcast, but that to me is emblematic of a kind of like 60-70 million dollar genre movie where I miss those. It's just like I love really kind of nasty, well-made action movies, and that one is both those things.
I will just very quickly, I want to give my friend's podcast a shout out. My friend Mark Hoffmeyer has a podcast called Deep Blue Sea, the podcast, where he and his co-host went through that movie DVD chapter by DVD chapter, and then they've gone on to other movies since then. But we will definitely be covering Deep Blue Sea because I feel like he would never talk to me again if we don't cover that movie. So
would it
Deep Blue Sea will
surprise
definitely
you?
get some love.
Would it surprise you if I told you that I have been on Mark's show? But
It would not surprise me because Mark is an awesome dude, and yeah, it's a match made in heaven.
I think I was in one of the very first episodes of that show.
Well, there you go.
I think I'm one of the few people to really stand for Deep Blue Sea in a way that's probably not commensurate with the quality of the movie. But I saw that at a screening, the first ever screening of it, and I watched people freak out when Samuel L. Jackson got eaten, and then I got to watch Samuel L. Jackson walk out on stage afterward, which was the most fun thing to see. So I bring that movie up a lot because I do love it, and I do think, as much as I love the very high end, well made, respectable movies in 1999, there was a lot of really well made junk in that year as well.
Yeah, we have a lot of friends who love Deep Blue Sea, so if we didn't cover that at some point, we'd be in trouble.
That makes me happy. It was a modest hit in 99. I love that it has a following now.
It was a crowded field in 99. Yeah. So as we have established,
I can tell you the movie I didn't cover that people were the most mad at me about, which is, I think, Jawbreaker. I think there was a 2019 movie. I'm trying to think. I had to actually go in and see some of the angry tweets I got from various people, but there was Jawbreaker, and gosh, was there one more? Oh, maybe it was no, I think no, because I did have She's All That in there, but no, certainly people were very, very, very upset about Jawbreaker not being covered, but I'm a Cheerleader, which I think I should have covered, and I think Drop Dead Gorgeous, that's the one that has a huge fan base. And I just couldn't include it, and boy, I heard about that a lot. So
I have I've over the last few months put out some feelers to some of our friends and colleagues about what they want to cover, and the two movies by far that get the most I want to talk about these two are Jawbreaker and Drop Dead Gorgeous.
Yeah, so I missed out.
There's a whole thing there that and I've only seen one of them, and I'm not going to say which. I don't want to get in trouble. So
I've seen neither of them, I'm pretty sure.
We will have seen them both by the time all is said and done. Anyway, all right, Brian, we're going to let you go. Before we do, would you like to point people in the direction of your book or Twitter or whatever else you want them to know about?
Yeah, I mean, the book's called Best Movie Year Ever, How 1999 Blew Up the Big Screen. You can pretty much get it anywhere. I mean, not at the grocery store. You can get it. It came out at Simon & Schuster, so you can get it on your Kindle. You can get it at the library. I don't tweet much, but I do, when I write a story or do something on a podcast, I usually put it out at Brian Raftery. And then I did Gene and Roger, which was a Ringer/Spotify podcast that's kind of annoyingly hard to find on iTunes.
It really is. It's weird. Yeah, it's buried. It's hard.
Yeah. That was a little frustrating. I didn't realize that. But if you Google, you will find it. If you Google, it'll eventually bring you to Gene & Roger. But that was a lot of fun, and I'm hopefully gonna do another podcast, movie podcast, fairly soon. Hopefully starting this fall or so.
Well, I endorse Gene and Roger. It's worth
thank you.
digging through whatever service you use to try and figure out where it actually is. But it is.
Yeah, email me and I'll read it to you over the phone.
There you go.
If you can't find it, I'll just
Perfect. You can find me on Twitter at probablyrealjb, at Joey is at SoulPopped, and the show is at 1999 Podcast. Brian, thank you so much. Joey, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you guys. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Brian.